Linsay, hello.
Hi.
And welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me in my space.
I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, so what are we doing? Here's what I was thinking. I had a part of my sermon on Sunday where I talked about iconoclasm, and specifically in the Muslim world, but I was like, you know, it wouldn't be fair of me to say this without like contacting somebody whose tradition is more adjacent to iconoclasm as the Reformed Church is.
Yeah.
And I know that the U in UCC includes Reform and other expressions of Christianity. Yeah. And I'm by no means asking you to be like, so you're the expert, but you're better than me.
Yeah.
And I also know a little bit about the tradition of like Lutheran Reformed dialogue around iconoclasm, but I'd kind of like to like fill people in on that a little bit too, and hopefully maybe we can come into like a new place, an updated place on this. But can you just start like at the very beginning? When I even say the word iconoclasm, like what does that mean to you, and what's your experience with that?
I mean, when we're thinking about it in terms of churches and church traditions, you know, we're here in your sanctuary, which is actually, you know, it has less images than a lot of Lutheran churches,
for sure,
right? And, you know, when I think about this space and our comfort with displaying images of God, that I think about, you know, if we were to be filming this in my church, you know, no images of anything in the sanctuary. There's no words anywhere in the sanctuary other than in books. You know, it's lovely to have these banners, and certainly lots of UCC churches would have, you know, such banners and images.
Big time.
But that I think about the simplicity of a congregational meeting house is this sort of blank slate, clear glass windows, look out on the world.
Where does that come from theologically?
I think a lot of it comes from this resistance to, you know, when we came over here, right? Because I center myself less at thinking about the Reformed tradition and more thinking about specifically the history of the Congregationalists that came from England to settle these churches here, and the UCC is 5 different streams, but the stream that I am most situated in and that my congregation here comes from is the Congregationalist stream of this trying to get away from the hierarchy that was present first in the Catholic Church and then in the Anglican Church, and that still exists in many of our beloved sibling denominations. But this coming away from this hierarchy, and also of buildings as these just really functional spaces. That it's less about, there's less of a focus on those images of God, but I think in the building itself. But as I say that, I think about my wife is a pastor at Old South Church in Boston, which has huge, beautiful stained glass everywhere. So, and that is a not uncommon sanctuary in the UCC Church.
Yeah, interesting, because the Lutheran Reform dialogue tends to be more driven by images and their meaning and the communication. I think it's an interesting dialogue in terms of like of all the different dialogues that the Protestant movement has had as an interior one. It was maybe one of the more people behave themselves kind of best at this one. You know what I mean? Like, not too bad, because ultimately, like when a Calvinist says to a Lutheran, like, I'm not sure about all these images, they do trust that the Lutheran is not doing veneration.
Yes.
Right? There's one thing that we're really solid on, is we're not venerating images, and like Luther was so clear about that I think it at least became a question of like, all right, well, functionally though, how many should be here? And there's funny stories about the churches in Germany at the time of when Reform and Lutheran circles were even worshiping in the same space, where some congregations would overnight like grab the statue of Mary and like sort of march it out of the church, you know, and then the Lutherans wake up in the morning and be like, where's my Mary? You know, we just want Mary.
I think what I love about stories like that is that it reminds us that pettiness among church people has deep historical roots. You know, people have been up to this for a long time.
Sure. I guess what I'm saying in that story is, at least at the end of the day, it was a little more civil than sometimes.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting to talk about this now. So there's, maybe if you want to separate those two experiences, like the Calvinist Lutheran dialogue experience versus the Congregationalist Anglican dialogue experience, which is just seems totally different.
Yeah.
You know, coming from a different place. Would you characterize as a almost more of a praxis debate around how are we practically carrying on the work of church?
I think it was practical, but it was also deeply theological, right? That there is something deeply theological about this idea that there is no intermediary between a person and God, that people, every person, just by virtue of being born and being themselves an image of God, right, is able to reason for themselves, think for themselves, vote for themselves, right? That it's a one person, one vote church, and that it is in no small part why there was democratic government was set up in Massachusetts and then spread. And so I think that is, in some ways, it's this, you know, pragmatic and praxis thing of like, how are we doing this? But that it's coming from and it's embodying a deep theology of who people are and who God is and what we need to be able to do church and to do life well.
So can I challenge you then on something, since we want to be a little bit challenging?
Yes.
Doesn't that, in this day and age, as we've moved away from the high Enlightenment values of logical positivism as, you know, a really optimistic stance on human reason, and have begun to walk back and say, my gosh, actually human beings are
kind of a mess.
We're totally a mess, and we're under all sorts of false notions all the time that exist from outside of us, and in fact it's very difficult to even like find the seat of human reason, whatever kernel that might be. And maybe the second challenge to say that immediacy of access, which is also in Luther, by the way, too. Luther's really excited about that. That now strikes a naive chord for me as I think about all the different intermediaries that there are in between me and God, and all the different ways in which my metaphors of who God are truly metaphors, not direct access. How do we deal with that? Like, how do we continue to uphold that value in the midst of it being so problematized?
So, the value of humans, human reason, human access to truth and to God, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I think, to me, that is precisely the reason why we want to limit the intermediaries, and specifically why we want to limit the hierarchies, because what I have seen time and time again in church, in politics, in any sort of organization, is that as soon as we put someone up on a pedestal, as soon as we put someone in power over someone else, they abuse that power, right? And that the people in power over and over again have failed to use that power well, and conversely have used it to abuse and to stay in power. And so the fact that we are more pessimistic now about human nature, I think is an argument against systems of hierarchy and systems of power, because if we're all messes, why are we putting people who we know are messes in positions of authority over vulnerable people?
Yeah, I'm going to butcher the line and also the guy, but there was that classic anarchist line where the guy was accused, like, how can you be so naive about human nature? He goes, how can you be so naive about human nature that you would trust a human to be in charge of another human?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so I think, and that's the, you know, sort of, you know, and this is where I find the biggest theological rub often between myself and people in hierarchical traditions, and that has been helpful for me to say, oh yes, this is so confirming to me. that I'm in the right tradition. But then when we think about the images of God, right, and our access to God, that I'm with you, that there's no way, we don't have any access to God that's not metaphor.
Sure.
Right? And that every image that we have is like the pinky thumbnail.
Sure.
And which I think is an argument for more images, right? More metaphors.
Yeah, right. That's where I was headed with this too. Right.
Right. Because if we had, if we were in a different church, there would be a big Jesus right here at the cross, and he would look a certain way.
Right.
And if you grow up in a church and you're only looking at that Jesus that looks one way, then you start to believe things about what God looks like. But then the more images you have, not just human images, but images of, God as, Jesus says, I'm the bread of life.
Yeah.
I'm the living water. I'm the gate. All of these really non-human images of what God is, that those get us to these other ways of thinking about who God is and what God looks like.
Yeah. That's I think what's exciting to me. I'm happy to see that you've taken us there already, because since about the 1950s on, we did structuralism, and then Derrida blew that up by saying, actually there's no structure at all to be found in human language, in human cognition, in human memory, in human writing. Foucault will go on to say that what you just said about power, about if we are not symbolically literate and we don't know how to do semiotics, we won't know when people are using symbols to do whatever the hell they want to us, by clothing themselves in a certain veil of authority or with some sort of ideology that can be abusive. But I think the accusation sometimes comes from out of the post-structuralist and school, is that they end up losing, because they're non-idealists, they end up losing an ethical framework or an ethical grounding. It becomes very relative. If it's all symbolic exchange, where's the real?
Right.
Where's the real rooted reality that we find ourselves in? And I think that's been the challenge of the age, really, is to not go back to naivete, where we think that we are doing direct access of God. We're really representing God, we're really representing authority. We'll know we'll never get back there again, because we've been awoken to the fact that human beings are fundamentally symbolic beings. We're doing semiotic exchange all the time. But how do we become both literate so that we know how to protect ourselves and do what we think is right, and find some sort of, if we're talking about God, for instance, you said the pinky thumbnail. That's all we got to go on. I can handle that, as long as I'm sure that it really is the pinky thumbnail, that it's not somebody, making it up for me. That seems to be the challenge of our age. And maybe I'll say one more thing, but that's probably too much to even respond to in one breath. But I tend to actually, believe it or not, with that challenge, have a little bit of an optimistic spirit about the rejoining of our traditions back together again. Because we have been stuck, I think, in a disagreement about symbols and semiotics that now appears to be a moot point.
Sure. I think there's so much we're in this, the great shakeup of the church, where we are realizing how stuff that wars were literally fought over, right? Like there are graves full of the victims of these wars that now you and I can just be sitting here being like,
I tell you, one of the things that has me excited about that too is actually the table. Because if you were to say that these words that I speak on Sunday, this is my body, this is my blood, if you were to say that those are symbolic words, and I were to say those are words of true presence, knowing now that true presence and true symbolism are actually the same thing.
Sure.
That we might find ourselves, somebody else did this work for us. Maybe we were in agreement the whole time.
Well, and I would also say that absent all of that, outside of or before or underneath any conversation about the words that we're saying or what it means, is just the act of sharing creates a lived reality, right? And that lived reality exists however we understand it. that lived reality of being in communion with each other exists, and that is, I think, how communion works. One of the ways that communion works with us with God is no one can come to me and say, I understand what's happening in communion.
Yeah,
it's
right.
like, buddy, you don't.
Right.
You don't. None of us can, right? Or that the understanding of communion isn't primarily a cognitive understanding, it's an embodied understanding, which is why Jesus gave us an embodied practice, not just a long manual.
Yeah, I really like that. It's great. Well, this has been awesome, and thank you for joining me. I was thinking before when we do this that I hope that we do come to a spot where we can sort of say like, hey, maybe there's an opportunity to do that embodied thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, both you and I, just even being here is a bit of that embodied thing.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, there's value in it just because I like hanging out with you.
Agreed.
But also that in this time where we are in, this shakeup of the church, that there is a temptation to get really lost in the weeds of what separates, and that it is good to just practice and saying like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to get lost in those weeds, right? That we can talk about it and we can hold and have these disagreements and similarities and, oh, I haven't thought about it that way. Let me think about it like this. But to remember that that's not actually what matters most.
Totally.
But we could spend a lot of time and energy.
Yeah, and the church has, and those graves that you talk about are real. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about how the Coptic Church and the Orthodox Church and the Western Church, the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, many times in which they have split, it hasn't been a disagreement over words or symbols. Yeah. It's been a disagreement over what other person might mean at some point in time about those words. And it's like, what if we just agree to walk with one another? Yeah. And all trust that even though you're using Coptic language to express a Greek term, and I might not fully understand what you mean by that translation, that I'll know you through our lived experience together, and we need not split the church yet again, violently. Right. Yeah. So here we are.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, Linsay. I appreciate it.
Yes.
All right.